So I'm a drummer. Let's say I write this drum beat that I'm really proud of. Something goes a little bit like this. And let's also say that I'm a really jealous drummer, so I don't want other people playing my drum beat. I don't want other people using it. I actually can't copyright the musical composition of that drum beat. Why not? The short answer is that it doesn't fall under the definition of copyrightable musical elements. These are the notes, melody, chords, and lyrics that make up a given work. Drums are a non-pitched percussion instrument, and as drummers we usually play rhythms and grooves, so that doesn't fall under that definition. Okay, so that's a nice definition and all, but at some point someone wrote these copyright laws. Why did they decide to focus on melody and not include things like rhythmic percussion instruments like drums? So this is where I would like to turn to language. One linguistic anthropological theory in particular suggests that language influences culture. So I want to explore the idea that the dominant languages of Western Europe have influenced this development as it relates to the Western musical tradition. So to properly explore this question, it's important to go back to the very beginnings of recorded Western music. One example of the earliest recorded music is Gregorian chant, and this is music that was sung in churches in the very early medieval times. We're talking like before the first millennium. Let's look at this example of the Gregorian chant, Haec Dies. What's going on in it? So this is a monophonic chant, meaning that there's only one note at a time. There's no harmony at all. And the rhythmic notation is like barely existent, and it's really underdeveloped compared to our modern notation. These factors, to me, suggest that there's a really deliberate focus on the melody of the music. In fact, polyphony, meaning playing more than one note at a time, which includes any sort of harmony, was really thought to be sacrilegious in these early periods. So now we can see with this early Western music that the focus is on the melody. It's got the prime importance. Why did the early music makers choose to make music in this way though? Why did they place the focus on the melody and eventually the harmony? Why is this the case? There are many ways that we might try to answer this question, such as considering how musicians might have been affected by the environment in which they worked, or even just looking at the general development of music throughout history. Now, without dismissing those theories, I want to focus on this idea that maybe it was also the languages of Western Europe themselves that also played a role in influencing the choice to focus on melody and eventually harmony in this early music. Let's take a brief look at a theory that can help us make sense of this. This is called the Linguistic Relativity Principle, or as I prefer to call it, the Sapir-Whorf Hypothesis. This hypothesis was formulated by two American anthropological linguists, Edward Sapir and Benjamin Whorf. And pretty obviously, the hypothesis is named after them. Briefly put, this hypothesis holds that a person's language will influence their thoughts and their culture. This means that speakers of different languages will have different thoughts and different cultures, partly because their native languages influence it. It also means that speaking a certain language will force you to be constantly aware about certain elements in that language. And that's kind of what forces you to structure your thought and culture in certain ways. So for example, in gendered languages, you have to constantly be aware of the gender of the noun and how that might affect how other words, such as verbs, adverbs, and adjectives, might agree with that noun. So according to this hypothesis then, someone who speaks a gender language, such as French, will have a different sensibility to gender in their everyday life, as opposed to someone who speaks a non-gendered or gender-neutral language, like English would. To gain a deeper understanding of this, let's look at my favorite example. Let's look at how we talk about directions in English. So if we're speaking pretty formally, we might use cardinal points like north, south, east, west. But if we're talking more colloquially, we'll probably use directions like left, right, up, down, front, back. English is a very egocentric language that way. In contrast, the Gugu Yimithir language, or GY for short, hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly, has words for cardinal directions, but does not have words for egocentric directions like left or right. This means if you wanted to tell someone to move over a little bit, you'd probably have to say something like, "Hey, can you move over to the south a little bit?" So speakers of languages like these are forced to constantly be thinking about their cardinal or geographic directions at all times. In fact, one report relates that a speaker of Tzeltal, which is another language like this, from southern Mexico, was blindfolded and spun around 20 times in a darkened house. And while he was still blindfolded and dizzy, he pointed without hesitation to the correct geographic directions. So it's not a perfect hypothesis, but it does give us some pretty fascinating ideas. For the sake of argument, let's accept it. Now the question is, how does it relate to music? So first, we need to find elements in language that are equivalent or similar enough to melody and rhythm in music. I want to start with rhythm first. So if we start with spoken language specifically, we might think of rhythm as being kind of the speed or cadence at which we are speaking, or even maybe the spacing between different words. If we look at poetry too, we might also think of meter, such as iambic pentameter. I'm going to be making some generalizations here, but I've noticed that at least with the Western European languages with which I'm familiar, the rhythm at which you speak a sentence, statement, phrase, or whatever doesn't actually affect the meaning of that statement. For example, let's take the sentence, "The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog." If I say it fast like this, "The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog," or if I say it slowly, "The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog," that doesn't actually affect the meaning of that sentence. Another way to put this is that in language, rhythm on its own, divorced from any words, doesn't really hold any kind of semantic value, if we can use that terminology. At least, that's my take on this. One of the purposes of language is to help us communicate, and in art is to tell stories. So I think rhythm in language, devoid of any meaning on its own when it's all alone, can help us give context to that communication and to our stories. So for example, someone who's speaking very quickly and in an irregular rhythm might be kind of nervous, whereas someone who's speaking in a very controlled and deliberate rhythm could signal that they're confident. So in this way, I think we can conceptualize a rhythm in language as these sort of shapes or structures that we can use to fit in our words and sentences and help give them context. So let's think again to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And this says that our culture will be affected by our language. Music falls within culture, of course, so it makes sense that music will also be affected by our language. So if we know that in our language that rhythm doesn't really hold any semantic value, then it makes sense that this happens in music as well, and so that the rhythm on its own doesn't really tell a story or doesn't really tell a narrative, it doesn't really have any meaning if it's not accompanied by any melody. So it's a little bit of a murkier relation, but by process of elimination, we're basically left with the melody as the musical equivalent of words and sentences in language, in the sense that in music, it's melody that kind of carries that semantic value. Now, that's not to say that rhythm doesn't play a part in melody, because it is an important component of a given melody. The point is that rhythm on its own, divorced from melody, doesn't really hold any of that semantic value. Another way of putting it is that if you present rhythm without any melodic content, it doesn't really mean a whole lot. It doesn't really say anything. To expand on that idea, consider the fact that we have pretty complex systems that govern our word choice in language. These are things like grammar, sometimes gender, and syntax. You have to keep all of these things in mind and try to get them correctly in order to tell the story you want to tell in language. The same thing is true about melody and harmony. There are many rules and guidelines that help us make those melodic and harmonic choices to best tell the story that we want to tell. You might think of things like consonants, dissonance, chord progressions, voice leading, putting phrases together to pose questions and make answers, stringing musical motifs together to create those said phrases, and more. Another way to think about this is to consider the lack of any formal rules or guidelines that govern rhythm in the Western musical tradition. Like, yes, people are expected to play in time with each other, but I'm talking about things that will help guide like your compositional choices. For example, concepts of like rhythmic dissonance or consonance are not really a thing, but they do exist in harmony. So for example, a standard guideline in Western music is that after playing a dominant chord, like this, you should resolve with the tonic, like this. But I don't know of any similar guidelines for rhythm that might say something, for example, like after a passage of 16th notes, you should resolve with a whole note. There's nothing of the sort that I'm aware of anyways. And that seems to be the case in language as well. For example, if I'm reading a random sentence off a paper out loud, there's nothing to really tell me how fast or how slow I should be speaking it. I kinda just have to figure it out. But Gab, you say, different styles of music do have different rhythmic guidelines. And I do agree with that. Like, you might have different rhythmic conventions for different types of classical dance music, or, a lot of popular music places heavy emphasis on the backbeat. Funk has a lot of syncopation. But I think the point is, if you write a song that's funky, no one will really accuse you of like stealing funk in the same way that you can actually steal someone else's melody. All that to say that the sort of semantic value or sort of story narrative content in music happens in the melody and in the harmony. Rhythm does come in and plays a role to give context and feel to that story, but it doesn't really tell a story if it's all alone. In a final word, it means that the traditional Western cultural conception of music places a heavy emphasis on melody and eventually on harmony as well. To conclude all of this, let's go back to what counts as copyrightable in music. There's the notes, melody, chords, and lyrics. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis holds that language would influence how a culture develops. We then looked at how Western European languages might have influenced the development of music in those societies to heavily emphasize melody and harmony. And this was in part because we saw that in language, rhythm all alone on its own is sort of devoid of any meaning. Put another way, in language, we find the meaning in our words, phrases, and sentences. And so in music, we find it in notes, melodies, and harmony. If our cultural conception of music already prioritizes melody and harmony, then it makes sense that those are some of the first elements that we're going to copyright. And although rhythm does play an important part in giving feel and context to those musical stories, all alone on its own, it doesn't really carry that same semantic value. And so it doesn't really need to be copyrighted. And so that's why we don't see drum beats being copyrighted. Although, as a drummer, I do think that some of the more unique ones should be. That's just my opinion though. So thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed getting to hear some of my thoughts on why rhythm doesn't seem to be such a big copyright priority and how we ended up there. I do also want to know what you thought about it though. Do you agree with my ideas? Do you disagree? Do you have a different opinion on how we got there? Do let me know in the comments because I'm really interested to hear what you have to say. If you want to see more content like this, please take a second to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and do turn on those notifications by clicking the bell icon. Thank you once again for watching. My name is Gab Lavoie, and I will see you in the next one.